media. I'd like to introduce Margaret Sullivan, the first woman to serve as editor-in-chief of the Buffalo News, and just a tremendous luminary in journalism. Such a pleasure to sit next to you. I feel less of a journalist being next to you.
Please don't.
Stefan Mihailu, who is, I think, very recognizable television news personality here, also expert in media relations, so he's very valuable to talk both from the hack perspective and the flag perspective. If you don't know what that is, you'll find out soon enough. And Jeff Kelly, the editor of Art Voice, who will be available for a dunk tank later on today if you want to throw balls at him. And so, okay. I'd like to start off by talking about, a lot of times we hear about a narrative in elections, and that seems to be the way that a whole race is framed. And I wanted to ask, how does a narrative develop in an election? Is that orchestrated by the campaign? Is it orchestrated by the media? And, yes?
Well, I know, of course, exactly what you mean, and I think, you know, we can look at, for example, the recent county executive race in Buffalo as, in Erie County, as one that developed a narrative. And I think that maybe it's a little bit of a cop-out to say this, but I think it comes both from an orchestrated effort by the candidates and from the media and from sort of random events that occur that feed into it and build into something. And then that has to be either managed or encouraged or snuffed out or whatever.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I'm running for county controller now. My claim to fame, I guess, so to speak, is being a red coat investigative journalist. I mean, I was a watchdog journalist for many years. So the narrative we're trying to tell in our campaign is that, as far as county controller is concerned, I have a business background, owning a business, but also that I was a watchdog and I uncovered fraud, waste, and abuse as a red coat journalist, and that's what I'm going to do as controller. It's really important. Everything that we do in our campaign for county controller is going to center around independence, independence, and independence. That's a narrative that we're going to be telling in this campaign. And so it's very important that your paid media or your earned media, that I'm going to try and reinforce the fact that I've been a watchdog and I'm going to keep an eye on politicians. A great example of that is the current appointed controller came out, and there's an issue concerning the borrowing for Erie County. So he came out with a statement that said, well, we're only going to save $800,000 through borrowing. Well, we pounced immediately when we heard that coming out of his lips, because that fit our narrative, holding politicians in power accountable. And you got to be careful too as a candidate that it's important to stick to your messaging and not venture away from that narrative. There's a lot of chance to do that along a campaign, and so it's really important that you could. But also too, a lot of that narrative, you know, Ms. Sullivan's absolutely correct that you have no control over whatsoever. So you got to really roll the punches and be flexible to some of the narrative that takes place in media as well.
And Stefan has illustrated that once you've established a good narrative, as he has, waste no opportunity to tell it. I say that both flippantly and seriously. That's absolutely true. Stefan just did the right thing. He's a candidate right now. The one thing I would add to what Margaret and Stefan have said is that, you know, one thing that really plagues our local politics, and I assume that most of you are interested in some sort of local races, is that there's often very little differentiation between candidates on the basis of policy and governance. More often it's differences of personality, differences of political faction, and those are not really compelling narratives for journalists or for voters. Journalists are tired of them. For voters, they kind of tend to reinforce a sort of negative attitude about our politics, that it's about power struggles and about personality struggles rather than about policy and governance. So if you are planning to become a candidate, if you are planning to run a campaign for a candidate, it's important that you establish, I think, that you differentiate yourself from your opponent based on something substantive, something that you can talk about. That's how you establish a narrative that is, I think, compelling, that is interesting, that will bring people to the polls, that will make people listen to you.
Yeah, and Jeff, that kind of segues into my next question, which is a lot of times, particularly when you're a first-time candidate or you're running as an outsider, it's very difficult to get media attention, especially if you're running against an incumbent. So how can candidates get the attention of the media and get substantive coverage in an election?
Set yourself on fire.
That does work.
Good thinking.
Yes.
Is that your plan, Stefan?
I hope not. For my family's sake, I hope not.
You know, you're right, it is tricky. An incumbent has no problem finding a microphone whenever he wants one or she wants one, and of course has no obligation to mention your name ever whatsoever. And in fact, would be foolish to do so. The thing you need to do, there are a couple of different things that I would recommend. One is basic hard work, persistence in contacting journalists, trying to sell this story of your candidacy. And the other is trying to find ways around established media. And I count Art Voice, although we are called the alternative newspaper. We are getting staid and old too. You know, there are lots of people doing things, reaching out and communicating in ways that we just don't understand or can't be bothered with, and you should understand them, find them, and use those tools to get your name out to people and your story. Use social media, use anything you can. Eventually, if you create a sort of presence in the world of social media for yourself, I will start to pay attention. Margaret will start to pay attention. TV cameras even will start to pay attention once Margaret pays attention. So, you know, that's what I would recommend. You've got to do the basic hard work that everyone has always done, which is relentlessly calling editors, having events, setting up your own microphone and hoping people come. You've got to do that, but you also have to find ways around the old ways.
Yeah, it's a great point too, and I'm not saying this because Ms. Sullivan's next to me, but I sat in television newsrooms for 14 years in Buffalo, and television coverage is driven by the Buffalo News, period. I mean, and that's a compliment. I mean, we'd sit around, the morning meeting, and of course, every single person has the paper in front of them because they have massive, massive resources that they put good use to it too. You look in the Sunday paper and the column, I think, where they have all the different communities. I mean, the Buffalo News does a great job. And so I think that the one thing I would recommend is get in the Buffalo News. Get in the Buffalo News and then get in the Buffalo News. Because the television will literally see it as though, okay, there's validation that this is a legitimate story. Or Art Voice for that respect. If people see it in print, they'll see it as validation that it's a good story. Jeff's right. Pick up the phone and start, in any way you can, managing relationships with reporters and assignment editors. I feel as though I can call Bill Flynn or Alan or Chris or Jeff at Art Voice and have a very frank and candid conversation about, okay, we're doing something, here's a story idea, here's what our campaign is working on. Also as well, I'm an underdog and I am not an incumbent, so it's tough for me to get any kind of coverage. So you have to make your story interesting and worthwhile. I mean, it's not just, hey, I'm going to the Cas Carnival and I'm shaking hands and kissing babies. Can you send a camera crew, please? You've got to have something with substance, that a journalist will say, okay, out of the 500 press releases they're going to get for a Saturday or Sunday, how are you going to make yours unique or different? So that's really, really important, is make sure that it's newsworthy. And also, too, I'm going to be the king of Saturday and Sunday press conferences, because those are the 2 days of the week where there is nothing going on, especially for television. You're more than likely to get coverage if you have something on a Saturday or a Sunday, as opposed to, case in point, this week. Can you imagine sending out a media advisory for Thursday or Friday, and you got Nick Walenda and the very unfortunate tragedy at ECMC? So just be aware of events that are taking place, and I'm going to be the king of Saturday and Sunday press conferences.
The words for that are slow news day. That's what you want, is a slow news day. Stefan said something I think really important he used the word relationships, and I don't think you can overestimate the importance of building relationships with journalists. So, get to know them in whatever way you can, and that will really pay off. I mean, it just does. The reason I'm here today is because I know Deborah Lynn Williams, and she called and asked me to do it. I mean, that's why. I think a lot of life comes down to that. And so to build those relationships with individual reporters, with individual editors, in whatever way you can, will definitely pay off.
And that also helps sell your narrative, right? Because if a person looks at you as a human being and you have an established relationship with them, they're going to be much more receptive to your message. I wanted to ask about, in terms of building relationships with reporters, if you can talk about the difference about speaking on the record, off the record, and deep off the record, and about how you can use those different relationships to build credibility and currency with journalists.
I'll take a crack at it. It's really important to understand that. You know, I think there's sort of a shorthand that people use when they say off the record. When people, you know, if you say to a reporter, well, for one thing, say it before, not after. There's no such thing as retroactive off the record. There just isn't. You have to say to a reporter, look, I'd like to talk to you about something, but it needs to be off the record. And then the reporter needs to say, okay, it's an agreement, all right? And it comes before. But a lot of people think off the record and on background and not for attribution all mean the same thing. They don't. They don't mean the same thing. You know, off the record means you can't use this. You can't use it. Well, why would you bother to tell a reporter something they can never use? Well, you may have your reasons. Maybe it's important for them to know it, even if they can't use it. But you can tell a reporter something about your opponent, let's say, and say, you know, look, this is off the record. Okay. Yes, okay. And then you tell them whatever it is you want to tell them, and the fact that they know it may cause them to then go and report it elsewhere. But they can't use it from you because it's off the record. However, if you tell them something that's, if you say, I'm going to tell you this, but you can't attribute me, that means you can't use my name, you know, and you may want to negotiate that. You know, you can say it's from a source in county government, if you work in county government, or you know, a source close to the county executive or something like that. Then the person can actually quote you, but not use your name. You know, background is kind of in between. You can use the information, but you can't attribute it. You can know it and use it, but you can't attribute it. So there's sort of different gradations of it. You want to be careful about it, and you want to make sure that you and the reporter are on the same page. Otherwise, you could get seriously burned.
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, anytime, as a PR professional, I worked on the county executive campaign last year. I'm working on my own right now. I just always assume that no matter what comes out of my mouth, it's going to be put on a billboard.
That is very smart.
I mean, it's always best to play it safe, because you never know. There could be miscommunication in, okay, can you please use information but not use my name? But all of a sudden you pick up a publication and there's your name and there's your quote. So I think the best policy is always to be open, honest, and transparent. I mean, as a journalist, it drove me nuts when I would have people in government say, hey, you know, can we go off the record? And they wouldn't even know what it means. I mean, as a journalist, I would always try as a last resort to use something either off the record or on background, because I think people question, all right, if people don't want to give their name or lend their credibility to something, well, they may not believe it, or they may take it less credible if it's some mystery unnamed source, or if it's Joe Smith, county executive. But always just assume, and I think it's a good assumption, that anytime you're talking to a journalist, always be open, upfront, honest, transparent. Never, 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 never lie. Never, never be dishonest, ever. Because once you lose your credibility in that respect, you're done. Whether you're in public relations or a candidate, always tell the truth, even if the information is damaging or hurtful. Always tell the truth. Because I think that, as going back to Richard Nixon, I mean, the cover-up is worse than the crime. I mean, it's, especially if you make a mistake on the campaign trail, that's okay, you're human. I'm going to make mistakes, probably a lot of them, unfortunately. And these two will be there to cover and report it when I do. Right, and that's okay, we're human. You know, I think the best advice would be to always, always tell the truth. And especially if you make a mistake, Tell it first, tell it fast, tell it yourself. Yep, you know what? I screwed up. I screwed up. This is why I didn't mean to say this, or I made this mistake in government, and then move on. People will be a lot more forgiving if you are open and upfront and honest about it, but you'll never be forgiven if you don't tell them the truth, because there are no secrets. None. Things will get out, and it's just best to be honest about it.
I would simply add to Stefan's incredibly important advice that don't use any of those designations as a veil for gossip either, for things you are not sure of, because that will burn your credibility with journalists as quickly as will a lie. If you give something to a journalist that you think may be true and could be interesting, and they go run around and check it out and find out that it's BS, or that you are just repeating something that has been circulating around political circles and varying to its truth, they will never trust you again. And it's as bad as a lie. Don't engage in gossip as a candidate. It's fine if you're not a candidate. If you're sitting around in a bar, feel free, please, and buy me a beer too. But as a candidate, do not spread gossip, and do not especially use those three designations, background, not for attribution or off the record, as cover for doing so.
But on the flip side, I mean, journalists deal in information, and it's very valuable for us to develop strong sources. And you can build great relationships with reporters by being a reliable source of information. And you can use speaking off the record as a very effective tool to get your narrative out there if you're crafting it in a way that's honest and worthwhile to the journalists. I want to know about sometimes candidates feel that they're getting short shrift from the media, or that something is being written that isn't true. Can you feel that you can call up a journalist and tell them what you're writing is unfair, or to dispute information, or is that just setting yourself up for more punishment?
I think it's totally legitimate. I want to hear from people who, and I do, believe me, who feel that they're not being treated fairly, or that something's wrong out there. And I will tell you that in general, we take it very, very seriously. I mean, we deal in the business of credibility. That's what we've got. That's what we're sort of selling, if you will. And if we are hearing from someone, that's not right, you're getting it wrong, here's the correct version of it, yeah, I think that in general, you will be taken seriously. And I think it's very important to do that, and not just sort of just say, oh, I need to take my lumps here.
And what Margaret just said is that the important part in there too is here's the correct version.
Yeah.
It's one thing to call and say, come on, I sound like a bozo in this. What's wrong? It's important if in an article or a TV report a journalist has gotten something wrong, show them what is right. Not just your opinion of what is right, but show them facts, so that you can prove to them that they made a mistake. And you'll find most journalists, with a few notable exceptions, will try to do right by you.
But also be very judicious in calling reporters, like with Ms. Sullivan, because you are so high up the ladder at the Buffalo News. If I had a complaint about a story, I feel as though calling her would be almost like hitting the atom bomb. You gotta, and that's why with your relationships, that's why it's so important. Like Bob McCarthy's their political reporter. If there's very rarely did we ever have an issue on the Collins campaign, or any story for that respect, but if I did, be very judicious in how you call and lodge that complaint. Like literally with Bob, it would be a 15-second conversation. Hey Bob, there was this in the story, maybe it could have been said this way, here's something wrong, and then I move on. I'd be very careful about picking and choosing your battles with media, because you don't want to engage in war with someone who buys ink by the barrel, meaning both publications.
And I think you need to know what it is you're trying to accomplish if you complain. Are you looking for a correction? So a one-paragraph item somewhere where no one will see it, that might make you feel good, or maybe it sets the record straight and it's worthwhile. Are you calling to? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to get a correction? Are you trying to build a relationship? Are you trying to get a better deal next time?
Yeah, you're trying to bargain for another story.
Right.
Yeah,
What
exactly.
are you out to accomplish? And I think you can to some extent, propose that. Look, I don't need you to correct this, it's not at that level, but I really feel like the next time you write about this, I hope you'll keep this in mind.
My old boss, New York City Parks Commissioner Henry Stern, used to say that a day without a press release is like a day without sunshine. And I was wondering how often you feel like candidates should issue press releases, and what makes for an effective press release?
Oh boy. You know, me being a media guy with our campaign team, I want to send like one a day. And they're like, Stefan, calm down. You're just running for county control, you're not the president of the United States.
Listen to your team.
Yeah, I said that a lot last year. You just have to make sure it's newsworthy. You know, you don't want to send media every single event that you're doing or every place that you're going, because after a while they're going to look at it and say, oh God, it's Stefan again, right in the recycle bin. Or if you send it via email, right by, delete. I always try and make sure that my press releases or the media that I'm doing reinforces my brand or my message. So again, mine is, okay, I'm going to hold politicians in power accountable as controller. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but we're putting out a press release this week that basically supports the Buffalo News in their request for information about the Buffalo Bills lease. Because certain politicians are fighting the Buffalo News on releasing information. Well, I'm a watchdog. I'm a journalist. And so we're going to put something out in the media this week about, hey, we support the Buffalo News or any media outlet that wants information about how our tax dollars are being spent. It reinforces my message that I'm an independent watchdog, and government, I believe this in my core as a journalist, that government works best when people have information and when government is open, honest, and transparent. So just make sure the information that you put out is, number one, newsworthy, is interesting, it's stories that people would be interested in, and just be careful of going overboard the way I want to every single day, and not let them know everything that you're doing.
I'd say one other thing about press releases, particularly if you're dealing with a kind of smaller community newspapers, that you have a lot of lazy journalists, or you have a lot of times when there just needs to be space filled in the paper. So I'm a big believer in writing your press releases in such a way that they could be cut and pasted into a paper. Now, you're not going to get that in the Buffalo News, but it behooves you to write it in a journalistic way so that it's an easy piece to plug in if somebody needs something to fill, to fill a quarter page, and that you've given a ready-made story, and that's a good way of getting your message out. I wanted to ask, Stefan, before this panel, you were saying that you were kind of blown away by how not media savvy so many elected officials and people running for office are. I was wondering if you could kind of explain more what you meant by that, and what are some of the foibles that are particularly grating to you?
Oh, it's shocking. It really was. It really surprised me how little, we're talking big candidates, how little they knew about media or how media works. And I've been blessed and fortunate because I've been in a newsroom, so I know the other side of the coin. Even just press conferences in general. Hey, let's have one at 7:30 in the morning. Okay, great. You want to have one when no one's in? Or, from a television perspective, hey, how about 5 o'clock in the afternoon? Okay, when everybody's in their live trucks and doing live reports and no one's available. And also, too, I think there's a general fear of media. It's not like you see in the movies where everyone's backstabbing and it's vicious. It's not like that at all. So I would encourage you, don't be fearful. Don't be fearful, don't be afraid of media. That's the big one that I saw, is that people had a lot of level of mistrust. Well, that's on them, that's not on journalists. Work as hard as you can to get to know people, make your contacts in media, whether it's the assignment editor, a photographer, reporters, or editors. I think just get to know the basics of how media works. That's the one important thing. And also, too, just about talking to reporters. I have a lot of clients in the private sector. We're talking CEOs who are afraid to pick up a telephone and call a reporter because they don't want to either be, the one gentleman told me, well, I don't want to sound like an idiot when I call them. I'm like, you're the CEO of a company and you're afraid to call media? That's the one important thing, though, is that they're not the enemy. They're not the enemy,
Adversary, maybe.
Exactly.
At times.
And should be. I think government works best because I'm a reporter when we have tough watchdogs as journalists and reporters.
Yeah, it's true. you can get yourself in a lot of trouble if you walk into a relationship with the media immediately mistrustful. What you're saying actually made me remember when Councilman Brian Davis's career was spiraling out of control, and Jim Heaney at the Buffalo News and Art Voice were taking turns revealing embarrassing things about him. And all of those articles ended, or somewhere along the way, that there was a sentence saying Brian Davis did not return phone calls for comment on this matter. And he never did. And at one point, when I think he was just about to resign, Damone Smith, who's a Maston District Councilman, took me aside and said, "How do I stop that from happening to me?" And I said, "Well, first of all, Damone, I don't think it's going to happen to you because I don't think you're doing what Brian Davis was doing. But second of all, just talk to us. You know, if I call you or if Jim Heaney calls you, return our calls. That's all it really takes. If you think you're in trouble with the media, you're probably not if you just call and give them your side of the story. It's probably not
Stonewalling is never a good idea.
It's the worst.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I mean, and then also, so how do you deal with damaging information, or if you're going into a campaign and you have trepidation that something's going to come out? I mean, what is the best way to kind of address your Achilles heel?
I think sometimes it's to put it out there yourself, possibly. If you think it's going to come out, you may want to bring it out and put your own sort of spin on it, and deal with it in a forthright manner.
It's like what David Patterson did on the first day when he became governor. He was
Right.
like,
That was an unbelievable
here's a long list of things that are about to come out about me.
Right.
Yeah.
What Stefan said earlier is right. I think too. Just say it loud, say it fast, say it first. Just go ahead and say, like, that's right. I did owe $3,000 to New York State for about 5 years. That's right. I don't anymore. But I did.
Yeah,
That happens.
And also, too, deadlines and being timely about it is really important. I mean, when I was a reporter, some folks would call me and say, okay, and obviously today being Saturday, well, sure, I'll be glad to talk to you. How's next week, Wednesday? Well, no, how's 30 minutes from now? The cycles are so quick in media now, especially with social media, that when it comes to journalists, I mean, call them back right away, and you have to strike while the iron's hot. Again, 3 days, even 6 hours is an eternity when it comes to news coverage. So I would just kind of get your ducks in a row and call back as soon as possible. The faster you deal with something, the better. My line when I would be doing a story, I tell people, okay, I'm sorry you may not like it, but my deadline is 11 o'clock tonight. I said, you have two choices. You can watch the story on TV, or you can be in the story. The choice is yours. Okay, I apologize, but that's the way it is. So don't think that you've got hours upon hours to work on something or to respond. In some cases, you've got literally minutes.
Also, this is kind of a corollary to all of this. It's not really addressing the question directly, but one thing you certainly do not want to do is get caught in the trap of responding to your opponent's press releases before those press releases have even become stories in some media outlet. For example, if Stefan's opponent puts out a press release that says, Stefan, when he was in high school, he cheated in his, student senate election. Nobody here is going to write about that. Nobody is going to bother even to research to see if it's true. If Stefan were to call hysterically and say, Jeff, come on, hear my side of the story, I'd be like, what? Is there a side of the story? So be careful about that. You don't want to respond to things that are not worth responding to.
He's absolutely right. I mean, this is somewhat strange, but I co-hosted a television show on Channel 2 up until about 2 weeks ago, and when I became a political candidate to get off the air. Well, my co-host is doing PR for my opponent. I mean, it's somewhat bizarre, but she's a really close friend of mine, and she's doing PR for my opponent. And so, and she told me point blank, she goes, we're going to do the Rose Garden strategy. We're not going to say a word between now and November. They said, we're basically going to ignore you and ignore all media between now and November. I said, good luck with that. We tried that last year, it didn't work. It didn't work.
Yeah.
And so that's exactly the track that my opponent's gonna take. I mean, they're literally gonna keep him quiet between now and November. And so my job as a challenger and as an underdog, I'm a massive underdog in this race. I mean, we did the turnout data with presidential elections. I'm down 100,000 to 0 right now. So that's how much ground I have to cover. So I'm between now and November, I'm gonna try as much as possible to get my opponent out of his shell and I have him actually talk to media.
Does it make a difference for you if you hear from a spokesperson versus hearing from the candidate themselves?
Yup.
Yes.
I'd say so.
What's the difference?
I think the spokesperson is much easier to ignore, and the candidate is probably going to have, you know, that's who you want to hear from.
Oh, boy.
Because you assume the spokesperson is there to tell, to convey this narrative over and over and over again, relentlessly. It is in fact that spokesperson's job, is to present an image which is, you know, anybody knows is not 100% of the truth. It's something, it's a commodity that you're selling, right? And so, you know, if you're a journalist, you don't want to get sold again. You want to get to the source of the story, which is the candidate, him or herself. So.
Yeah, I mean, I did it on the Collins campaign last year. And again, we had the thought process of, okay, you know, Chris is the incumbent. We'll do the Rose Garden strategy, which means basically you ignore reporters, you don't go to events, and you let your spokesman be the pit bull. Well, again, that didn't work out very well. We lost. And so that was an important blessing, though, for a lesson from my campaign, is that I'm running countywide with a potential voter base of 600,000 voters, but I spend almost 3 hours a night with Wayne Howard in the back there. He's my campaign coordinator. I'm knocking on doors. I literally go door to door every single day. I've got 8 events that I'm going to today. I've had more chicken barbecues, and I've gone to more lawn fates in the past 2 weeks, and I'll go through a pair of shoes in a week. But, you know, both of these folks are correct, because when you hear from a spokesperson, it's going to sound like spin. It's not going to sound genuine. It's going to sound like, oh, they're spinning something, they're hiding something. There's a lot more credibility when the information comes from you as a candidate.
We're going to go to questions in a moment. I just want to ask one more question. Stefan, you were talking about how you're going to do a lot of Saturday and Sunday press conferences because they're slow news days, and that's certainly how Senator Schumer built himself a great deal on doing Sunday press conferences. They're really famous. I think it's said that the most dangerous place to be is between Senator Schumer and a television camera, right? So I was wondering, you know, who do you see as really a media savvy candidate, and what makes for, you know, a candidate who catches the eye of reporters?
We hit the nail on the head. I mean, Charles Schumer, our U.S. Senator, I mean, he would personally call newsrooms when he was in D.C. and say, hey, I'm going to be on a satellite. I'll do an interview with you about X issue. And of course, you're not going to say no to a U.S. Senator, so he would get on the news that day. He's very aggressive when it comes to earned media, which means your press conferences, earned media, Art Voice, Buffalo News, television. Saturdays and Sundays, I would highly recommend doing any kind of campaign events or events where you want media on a Saturday or a Sunday, because it's an extremely slow news day. People are really looking and kind of grasping for straws sometimes, you'd be shocked, at content to fill for a newspaper or a television newscast. But again, just make sure it's actually something people would be interested in. And he's very good at it. I mean, I would love to do the analysis if I had about 4 years to do, okay, the issues that put out in a press conference, and then that's something that actually became legislation. You know, because there is a truth in the politicians basically legislating by press release. Oh, I passed this. Well, okay, did it become law? I'd love to see the analysis on it.
I would say that Kathy Hochul comes to mind as someone who uses the media very well, and actually is just a smart politician. She, for one thing, she's everywhere. I heard she was here earlier. She's been every single place I was this week, I feel like. But she has done a very good job of having a message, staying on message, knowing what the media cares about, knowing, you know, what the hot buttons are. She's very good at it, and her campaign was interesting in the way she relentlessly stayed on the message of not harming, you know, governmental programs such as Medicare that were extremely important to the community. I mean, you could ask her whatever question, but you would always get that answer. And it served her very well.
Brian Higgins is also quite good at it. Sean Ryan, who's a new assemblyman, is showing himself to be pretty good at it. He's on the campaign trail, so he has to be, and I think he's been doing a pretty good job. Crystal Peoples is actually very good at it too. She presents herself very well, very well at press events. At events that are not press events, she always manages to appear and say something very intelligent and useful. Like as a journalist, I think Crystal, good. I'm going to quote that. She's really talented as well. Go to some event where she's going to be and watch how she gets on stage and see what she says. She did it just a couple of weeks ago at the Birchfield Penny. There was an anti-fracking event there, and she took to the stage and had the whole auditorium eating out of her hand in like 30 seconds. She spoke for 30 seconds. It's great.
What Margaret was saying about Kathy Hochul repeating her message, I think is a really good point too. It's like a lot of us think that repetition it's like, you know, if you were just telling your friends the same thing all the time, you would be an odious bore, right? But as a politician, that's to your advantage to repeat yourself all the time. And you might have to give the same statement again and again and again to all the reporters, but that's how you control the message. A lot of us don't realize that, you know, the President of the United States is going around giving the same exact speech in city after city after city, and if you were following the president like that, you know, that gets tedious, but that's because he's trying to drive home that point. And if you're trying to establish a narrative, establish a message, that lies in repetition. And I wanted to point out another brilliant politician. It was Hillary Clinton. And the way that she came in and ran to be our senator, you know, here was a superstar first lady. And I have to say, I remember going to a press event with her in 2000, and how one of the things that she did that was so brilliant was she would repeat your name, she would remember your name, she would speak to you like, you know, it's so easy to be the politician and to think that everyone you're speaking to is insignificant, but it's actually absolutely the flip side. You know, you want to show people how important they are, and that if you're an elected official and you're talking to people on that level, well, now they feel that they're meaningful, and you build a relationship with them. So that's really valuable. Questions from the audience? Yes.
I think for a lot of people, they're very intimidated by calling their first press conference. So could you demystify the art of the press conference a little for people and give advice about what makes for a good press conference?
I still get scared, to be honest with you. We were talking about honesty and being truthful. And a lot of times, the most thing that I'm fearful of is no one shows up. You know, I think you have to just make it interesting and give journalists a reason to come. These guys and gal, they probably get 500 press releases a day. So how are you going to set yourself out? That's the one thing is this really newsworthy? Am I going to make an editor read it twice and say, wow, I have to come to this? So I think that's the big thing is where you have it, what time you have it. And I think the most important thing is this newsworthy? Is this going to make an editor who gets 500 of these say, I have to go to this today? And don't be afraid. I mean, nothing ventured, nothing gained. You know, you may get skunked and no one shows up. Well, you know what? No one's showing up if you don't put it out there anyway. So just go for it. Go. The worst thing you can do is say no. I mean,
yeah, and if no one shows up, that doesn't mean that the story isn't going to be told. You've sent a press release. You've sent the information that you actually would like to have turned into a story, right? So, I mean, I've gone to press releases where I'm the only person there, and I can see the disappointment, you know, in the speaker's eyes, and I'm just like, well, who cares? I mean, the Buffalo News has your press release, so does Channel 4, 2, and 7, and YNN, you know. It doesn't really matter. The press event is really an excuse to get out the story. Follow up with phone calls afterward. If there's nobody there. Just because people don't show up doesn't mean they're not interested or can't be made interested. I mean, my newspaper we're like 3 people. So, you know, when you call, you are talking to an editor and a reporter. The Buffalo News has got more resources, but they cover more. So, you know, so they're spread thin too, despite their wealth of resources. So you're not always going to get everybody to a press conference.
real quickly, I'll give you a hypothetical. I've been told my opponent will not debate me. He's going to be in his turtle shell for the next 6 months. So hypothetically, I'm thinking in my head for a press conference, okay, I can go to the steps of the Wrath building, scream and holler, and that'll be it. But I think it might be a little more visual and interesting if I show up at one of his fundraisers, I don't know, go to some costume show and have a nice throne with a crown sitting on top of it. And I'll stand next to a throne and say, okay, the unelected appointed comptroller won't get off his throne or his high horse to come and talk to me.
You should have your own fundraiser in the parking lot outside.
That might be a little more newsworthy because I'm providing a visual. A candidate is going to his opponent's fundraiser as a hypothetical, just to get the wheels turning about, okay, how can I make this newsworthy or interesting? Because it's not really newsworthy if I just go and take my face for radio and scream on the steps of the Wrath building.
Yes,
Stefan,
please.
I noticed that you're being very good in not mentioning your opponent's name, which I guess another media, perhaps, tool, if you will. You've mentioned, the panel, you've mentioned no attribution, you've mentioned on background, and you've mentioned off the record. What are your comments to a political candidate to the words, no comment?
Oh, kiss of death. God bless America. Don't ever tell a reporter no comment. Please don't do that. Please don't do that, because then it looks like you're hiding something. You're in a defensive position.
Say something.
Yeah. Those are the worst. Please scrub those 2 words from your vocabulary. If there's anything you take away from what I share with you, please scrub that from your vocabulary.
The only situation in which you ought to have no comment is when you are asked a question which is not germane at all, which you literally know nothing about, because it has nothing to do with the race you're running, nothing to do with your own personal history. You just literally don't know. And do not say then, I don't really have a comment on that, because those words are they're like read to a bull for a journalist. Instead, just say, I just don't know. I don't really know anything about that. That's fine. That is in fact refreshing. So.
But also, too, very quickly, you're never hurt by anything you do not say. So the golden rule for me in dealing with my potential opponent is when your opponent's making mistakes, get out of the way. Doesn't make any sense for me, if he's really having some major blunders and the Buffalo News is hammering and Our Voice is hammering him or her. Sometimes it is best to be quiet, but you don't say no comment, so no thank you, I'll let my opponent handle that one.
I think it's also important to make sure you always think before you speak. If you'll see a technique that a lot of savvy politicians use, like in debates when they're asked a question that's a real hard one, they're like, that's a good question, right? And they say that for 2 reasons. One, it makes the reporter feel good about themselves. And the other thing is it buys them that 10 or 15 more seconds so that they can think about the answer. Because if they just go straight to the answer, they might, step into a minefield. And so, if a reporter asks you a hard question on the phone, and you need to take that 10, 15 seconds to formulate your answer, that's not going to be reflected in the article that, I thought for 20 seconds before I responded. Think and formulate an answer that's going to best represent you, because that's going to be the record after that.
It was one of the best things that ever happened to me. So Luke Ravenstahl is mayor of Pittsburgh. I was working in Pittsburgh when he sort of fell backwards into a city council seat. His father ran a political machine on the north side there, and I think he was 21. He became a councilman by default, sort of. And he was like a deer in the headlights. And from there, he actually fell backwards into president of the city council. And then the mayor died, so he became mayor. I mean, astonishing political career young Luke Ravenstahl has had. And I interviewed him on his first day as a city councilman. And I was loaded for bear, because I thought this kid doesn't know anything. He didn't even do I think he graduated from college by the skin of his teeth like 1 month earlier. And I went up to his office and sat down, and I started asking him questions. And as I mentioned before, he just kept saying, I don't know, I really should know that. And then he took notes on my questions, which made me think like, gosh, it was so disarming. I was so, he must think that I'm smart, that these are such good questions, which they were not, they were quotidian, but that has stuck with me for, 10, 12 years.
Yes.
I have a question about the idea of staying on message. It makes sense from the candidate's perspective, but from a journalist's perspective, is that frustrating? Is that annoying to hear someone keep going back to the same thing and mostly avoiding what you've just asked?
I think it can be frustrating, it can seem annoying, but I think it works. I mean, you know, you want to use some judgment with it. You don't want to say the same sentence 4 times and say it every time you go out of the house. But, you know, to have a general idea of what your narrative is and what you're trying to get across and to sort of stay with it makes sense.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, again, I go back to Wayne Howard, who's our campaign coordinator. He must have heard me over the past 3 weeks say, yeah, the unelected controller appointed by political party bosses is a lapdog who's meant to let politicians play games with their money. I'm an independent watchdog who will go after Republicans and Democrats. I have a track. Literally, he's probably heard that 4,000 times. But if someone from Art Voice or the Buffalo News calls me about a specific issue about borrowing, and I start hammering those points, I mean, that damages my credibility. Be smart about your messaging and sticking to it, but you have to pick and choose your battles and when it's appropriate, and when it makes sense, because you don't want to look stupid. I don't.
Yes, I liked Jeff's story about dealing with the Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh mayor. Someone might want to try that strategy with Scanlon. But my question is about open secrets in politics. When I was living in Rochester, my state senator was caught in bed with a woman, not his wife. He was caught in bed by the jealous husband, who then proceeded to beat the crap out of him. This was an open secret in Rochester politics, but it was never written about in the media. And I'm just curious about how we can have these things, that everybody knows about, but yet no one knows about them unless they happen to show up in the Buffalo News or Art Voice. Can someone enlighten me on that?
I'm so glad we've gotten into this subject. The subject of candidates' personal lives, I mean, you're really asking about 2 different things. There's the question of open secrets, which is a good one, and also the question of when is it appropriate to delve into a candidate or an office holder's personal life. And that is something that, it's a very interesting question, and it's one that's changed over the years and took a really dramatic change when Gary Hart was running for president and, dared the nation's media to follow me around, which they did, and that was his demise. The media, responsible media, is generally not too enthusiastic about getting into a candidate's personal life. It has to matter in some way. The fact that someone had an affair, that's probably not going to get in the paper. We don't write about that unless it has some impact, unless it's germane in some way. The broader question of open secrets, I guess I'd say some of the same things. It has to matter. How does this matter? Does this make the politician corrupt, or does it mean that he has bad judgment? What are the ways in which this should matter to the electorate?
Yeah, the thing, the media is a pretty broad spectrum now, and so it doesn't matter if the Buffalo News or Art Voice say, we don't report about people's affairs, their sexual orientation, their DWIs from 20 years ago, as opposed to say their DWIs from 20 days ago, which might you could make an argument there, right? Because it could affect your a sense of what their judgment is, and also their ability to perform their job. But that doesn't matter if we are prudish about those sort of things, or not prudish is the wrong word, but in any case, there are so many different kinds of people reporting on blogs, on YouTube, various different ways, that you can't assume that you can't count on the good judgment, if I may be so bold, of Art Voice, the Buffalo News, or whoever. Somebody, if you do something crazy, someone is going to communicate it.
You're sort of segueing into my question. We've talked a lot about print media, news media, but there's a whole bunch of media out there that's the social media. How How does that work for you, work against you? What's the best strategy? You ignore it, you not ignore it, et cetera, et cetera?
I'll take a crack at that. Well, one thing I'd say is, you know, in building on what both Jeff and Stefan have said, there is no privacy. Don't assume that there is. Also, I would say you can't really ignore social media. You ignore it at your peril. You really have to understand it and use it. You've got to use Twitter, you've got to use Facebook, and you've got to be up to date on the next 4 things that are coming along to challenge Facebook and Twitter, and to be savvily using those things. So on the one side, there is no privacy, and on the other side, you have to use the stuff.
And develop very thick skin, very thick skin.
And things do blow over.
Right. I mean, when I was a reporter, I did a story about Buffalo cops who wasted about $300 grand in taxpayer dollars because their contract said they can donate blood. So these guys would line up, donate blood. And so I did the story, and I got death threats from Buffalo cops. So I feel as though I can handle anything on the campaign trail, but don't read a lot of the messages and the blogs. And, you know, I think I maybe even sent you a card or sent you an email commending the Buffalo News, that they have a responsible message board where you have to post your name and your address and things of that nature. Because if you start following everything that's written about you on Twitter and Facebook, your head will explode. So have really thick skin and just ignore a lot of the things that you do see. Be very careful about engaging in any kind of Twitter war or Facebook war.
Yeah, do not respond.
Oh, God bless America, don't.
Do not respond.
Yeah, you can actually make it much worse. Much worse by taking it seriously and bringing it out into a public forum. You may feel like, I can't just sit here and let them attack me, but yeah, actually you can.
Yeah, and certainly use all the tools you can find, and if you don't know how to use them, find someone who does and get them on your campaign staff. But do not confuse Facebook friends with votes. Do not imagine that.
Or with friends.
Yeah, or with friends. and do not imagine that if someone says on an event page that they're coming, that means they're coming.
Susan?
So you've talked about how there are times when you absolutely have to talk directly to the press. A spokesperson is just seen as some sort of a diversion. So what is the appropriate use of your communications staff? How should you expect them to interface with the press, and how do you use them appropriately?
Well, I think it depends on the campaign. I mean, even though my position is a county-wide position that I'm running for, I don't need a spokesperson. I think, in my opinion, the candidate should speak as often as possible, because that's most credible, I think, with media. You know you're not being spun or you're hiding something. But a lot of times, it's just practical. I mean, when I was spokesperson for Chris Collins last year, I mean, there were times where he literally said, you know what, I'm spending the day with my family. My son's at Villanova, I'm not around, Stefan, you take care of it. And so I did as best as possible. So I would strongly recommend that as often as possible, the candidate, you speak on your own behalf. But sometimes with bigger offices like county executive or Congress, governor, senator, sometimes you just can't. And I think then it's appropriate to have a spokesperson do the heavy lifting for you if it's not an issue that's really, really major or big. But for, even like I said, from a county controller's perspective, I will never let a spokesperson talk for me. I'm going to do it myself.
I'm going to sound as a sort of cynical note here, if I haven't already, which is that so a campaign spokesperson's job is to aggressively get the message out to the media in order to get it to the public. I mean, the media, we're just there to sort of amplify it, right? And you want to differentiate between what a campaign spokesperson does and what an elected official spokesperson does, which an elected official spokesperson does that too, to a degree, in a measured sort of sense, but he also is there, he or she is there to insulate the politician. Your campaign spokesperson should not be there to insulate you, just only to sort of amplify your effectiveness at getting your message out.
That's a good distinction.
Yeah, very quickly, there was a former Democratic county executive who was beautiful at the bait and switch. You know, I'd call with a hard-hitting story and say, hey, I need to talk to him in 15 minutes. Oh, sure, no problem, come on up. So I'd come up and I'd say, oh, you know what, he's in a meeting, come on, we'll have our spokesperson come out. It drove me crazy. And as a journalist, again, that, you know, Jeff's right, your antenna go right up and like, okay, what are they hiding? So I would highly recommend that you speak on your own behalf as often as possible.